We are. Just make sure that I'm not. Okay. So, what's up? How you doing?
Good.
Good. Sheldon. How do you pronounce your last name?
Estreicher.
Estreicher. We're at the home of Sheldon Estreicher in Aventura,
Florida. Right.
It is November the 1st, 2018. And we are here to talk about your father, mostly. But before we get into talking about your father, please, if you could just introduce yourself very briefly to me.
My name is Sheldon Estreicher, and I was born in Israel in 1952 in Rishon LeZion. Subsequently, my parents moved to Cleveland, Ohio, where I grew up. Mm-hmm. I went to Ohio State University College of Dentistry in Columbus, Ohio, and lived there for most of my adult life. And I moved to Aventura, Florida 6 years ago to the place that I live here now, called Williams Island.
Okay. Sheldon, let's talk about your father. What was his full name?
He was born Elimelech Estreicher.
Elimelech Estreicher, and he was born
in December 16th, 1916.
1916.
In Bardejov, which was a small city in Czechoslovakia.
Which was then actually the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Which is the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Because Czechoslovakia only was founded in 1918. They're actually celebrating right now, the 28th of October, 1918 is when they got their independence. So they are just currently celebrating their 100th anniversary. Czechoslovakia. But he was born in Austro-Hungarian Empire during the First World War.
During the First World War.
Where geographically do you think it's located, the town?
Bardejov? I'm not sure.
Is it Slovakia? Is it Czech?
It's Slovakia.
Slovakia.
I believe it's Slovakia.
So it's the lower part of Czechoslovakia.
Yes.
Slovakia. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, and his Czech name, like his Elimelech, but I'm sure he has an Eli, or how did he go by? Or
they lived in a little shtetl.
Right.
They went by their Hebrew names, and he did not have any other names that I'm aware of.
That you're aware of.
All right.
Anything that you know about his family background?
His father's name was Shlomo Estreicher. His mother's maiden name was Betty Spiro, and he was one of 11, the youngest of 11 children, and he didn't have much. He had that typical cheder education, and then that's it. They all go to work, at 10, 11, or 12 years old.
Sure.
And that's what I know.
At some point, he immigrates to the United States. Is that correct?
That is correct. In 1935, he and several of his brothers all emigrated to the United States in February 1935. And I can't tell you for sure why, but they ended up in Cleveland, Ohio.
Okay. Is there anything that you know about his early childhood, like from when he was born until?
No.
Not a lot.
None.
Nothing. Okay. So they immigrate to Cleveland. Mm-hmm. Your father's 19.
Correct.
What does he do?
He gets odd jobs. I remember him telling me that he was Shomer Shabbat. Mm-hmm. And if you were Shomer Shabbat, that was very problematical because pretty much every employer at the time needed somebody to work on Saturday. Mm-hmm. And if you could not work on Saturday, that was problematical. He told me that he found a dry cleaning company that would allow him not to work on Shabbat. And that's basically what he initially did. Mm-hmm. He told me that some of his brothers, failing to find employment, ended up opening their own businesses. Because that's what Jewish people do. When they can't be employed, they end up opening their own businesses. One brother, he said, opened up a vegetable stand. And he said 2 other brothers opened up a printing company, and so that they could work.
Did you know these brothers?
Yes,
These
these are my uncles. Yes, yes.
Wow. So he. What does he do? What does your father do? He works for.
So he works for a dry cleaner, and then slowly but surely he gets involved in real estate, but in the sense of like he would purchase a house, fix it up,
flip it,
and flip it.
Yeah.
Nothing's changed in 80. Nothing changed in 80 years. No. He was very handy, you know, with painting and wall covering and this and that and whatever. And so that was his. That's what he ended up doing in his early 20s and mid 20s.
In his early 20s and mid 20s.
Right.
And he, of course, is active in the Jewish community. He is.
Yes. So from the records that I was able to establish, he joined.
Don't look at the camera. Look at me.
From the records that I was able to establish, he joined Hashomer Hatzair of North America in 1936.
Even though he's religious.
Right.
So
well,
it's Hashomer Hadati.
It was I have the card. It's Hashomer Hatzair of North America.
You have the cards.
I have.
You will look at them after.
Yeah. And so I can't speak to what Hashomer Hatzair was in 1936. In Cleveland, right. But maybe that was the only game in town.
Maybe that was the only game in town.
Yeah, I don't know.
So he joined in 1936. 21 years old.
Right.
20.
20. Yeah. In 1938, he joins Poale Tzion of America.
In Cleveland.
In Cleveland. So again, I cannot tell you what the status of those organizations were and what other options there were. But the fact of the matter is that somebody who would join Shomer Hatzair and Poale Tzion obviously was a Zionist, because
say no more.
Say no more. I mean, who else would join those organizations? Right. And you're talking 36, 37, and 38.
Right.
I mean, this is 10, 12 years before the state of Israel is even established.
So he's active.
So he's active in those organizations, and he's also active in the Jewish community.
Okay.
Mostly the Jewish community at that time. There was something called the Young Israel of Cleveland, which was just a brand new organization of modern Orthodox synagogues. As yet, there were no day schools there. There were no yeshivot there. It was just in the beginning of when all of this stuff was happening. And but he and all his brothers came from a Orthodox family. And I would say that in Cleveland, Ohio, they were probably
Modern Orthodox.
Modern Orthodox, and the founders of the, with others, founders of the modern Orthodox community in Cleveland.
Does the modern Orthodox community at that time in Cleveland have a flagship synagogue, or is it just kind of like figuring out what it needs to do?
It was called the Young Israel of Cleveland.
Hold on a second. I'm just going to move it a little bit. Hold on. There we go. Perfect.
It was called the Young Israel of Cleveland, which I believe was formed in the mid-40s, mid-1940s.
Hold on a sec. Mid-1940s.
Yeah, late 30s, mid-1940s. There was, and it's a national organization. Most people have heard.
What do people call your father in the States? What's his name?
Martin.
Martin.
So somehow it went from Elimelech to Martin. I have no idea.
Okay. Martin.
I have no idea.
Okay. And him and his brothers are all in Cleveland, so they got a kind of like a tight ship.
We had a large family presence in Cleveland. My father, 4 of his brothers, and a sister. So there were 6 of them.
Out of 10.
Out of 11.
Out of 11.
The 5 who did not come, unfortunately, were killed in the Holocaust. Those who got out survived. But the ones that did not, the ones that did not come out were older.
Okay.
They already had families with children.
Sure.
Most of the uncles that came and my father that came were single, and it was much easier for a single person.
Sure.
But once you're, so
into the new world.
Yeah, the other ones had families and children, and
of course, their ends were in Auschwitz
and all of them were lost in the Holocaust.
Wow. So let me ask you, Martin is, he's about 22, 23 years old, maybe 24 already. He's working, flipping houses. He's active in the community. World War II breaks out.
So my father becomes a naturalized citizen.
In what year?
In November 20th, 1942.
Okay.
And about a year later, he is inducted into the United States Navy.
Into the Navy?
He may have picked the Navy, I'm not sure.
Okay.
But he's inducted into the Navy, the United States Navy, and serves 2 years approximately, from 1943 till 1945, the end of the war. He serves in the Navy, not overseas. He's assigned to some Navy base, supply depot in the middle of Oklahoma. What can I say?
Where there's a harbor, of course.
Where there's, But I think it's a supply depot for the Navy. And he serves as a chaplain, as the Jewish chaplain.
He serves as a chaplain?
As a Jewish chaplain of the Navy at the base.
Because he's the only Jew in Oklahoma?
That's right, in Oklahoma.
Yeah.
Of which I have some pictures to show you.
Okay.
And he is discharged like everybody else is after the end of the war. And that's where we're at this point. So
he does his duty in the war effort.
Correct. By the way, just so you know, I saw a documentary. About 500,000 Jews served in the United States Army, Navy, Marines in World War II.
500,000. Wow.
Jews.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And he was one of those 500,000.
Yeah, I had an uncle who was a cousin, who was a Marine, who was killed in the Gulf of Leyte in the Pacific.
In the Pacific.
Yeah, he was a Marine. Yep, and he was in the Detroit Tigers farm team.
Oh.
He was a pitcher.
Wow.
Yeah, so also one of the 500,000 Jews that served in World War II. After the war,
After the war, he goes back home and continues what he was doing, purchasing homes, flipping, fixing them up and selling them.
Yeah.
And the next thing I know, he is getting a passport because he is intent on making Aliyah to, at that time, Palestine.
Sure. Do you know how this bug got into him, of him making...
Well, I mean, his history was he was part of Shomer HaTzair, he was part of Polei Tzion, so obviously he was still single. It's after the war. Everybody hears what's going on in Palestine. The British are, not allowing the refugees to come. There's detention camps in Cyprus. And he felt that he needed to do something to be a part of it. And on that basis, he made a decision, again, as a single man, he made a decision to make Aliyah. And whatever skills he could bring to bear, as far as having been in the Navy, he was going to volunteer as part of that group of foreign fighters called Machal, which is an acronym for Mitnavei Chutz La'aretz, and he joined that organization. And
in the States?
In the States.
Where in the States? Do you know where?
In Cleveland, there was a Machal branch.
Okay.
He was told to report to New York, and he reported to New York, and from that point on, about 100 Machal guys from the United States, they boarded a ship called the SS Marine Carp, which was a troop transport ship in World War II. It was a Navy transport ship that transported troops, to and from combat zones.
Yep.
And about 100 ex-GIs boarded this ship, bound for Palestine.
Do you know is there a date on that?
Yes, and that is they boarded the ship on November 3rd of 1947.
Wow.
And they arrived in Palestine on November 23rd, 1947.
Right before the UN.
It was 6 days before the partition vote on November 29th of 1947.
Okay. So, do you know what your father was doing in New York before they sailed? Do you know if they were smuggling? Or?
All I hear was they were raising money.
Okay.
Because the soon-to-be state of Israel needed money for everything. They needed money for troops, they needed money for ammunition, they needed money for arms, they needed money. And basically when they got to New York, the boats had already been purchased, to get on, but they were basically asking for donations from pretty much any Jews. And it had to be done clandestinely because this wasn't, this was not something that...
So does your father leave with a passport? Or
yes, he has, and I have the passport.
He gets stamped?
Yes. So it's there's a ruse going on. His passport and the other 99 people that he went with, they are traveling to Palestine to attend Hebrew University as a student. And I have that passport and I can show it to you. So there was this ruse that they're going to Palestine under the guise of, we're going to Hebrew University.
They're going to study under Martin.
We're going to study whatever.
Martin Buber.
For a 3-year period of time, and so that was and that's how they got in.
So he actually left legally.
Correct.
Because most of those guys left illegally.
Right. He left legally. His passport was stamped, and he got
because a lot of people had problems coming back in and went to jail and had their citizenship.
Well, coming home was another story.
Of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
But
so they leave on November the 3rd.
They arrive in Palestine November 23rd.
Did they stop anywhere? Did they stop in Marseille? Did they stop?
The boats had on the itinerary was Istanbul, Beirut, Alexandria, Haifa.
So it's a total commercial.
It had to look like it was commercial.
So they weren't picking up refugees on the way.
No.
Like the other.
But they had to submit an itinerary that made it look like it was a cruise. Did
he ever talk to you about this voyage?
No,
he never did, huh?
No.
So he arrives in Palestine.
November 23rd, 1947.
What do we know about where he went and what he did?
Not much. I mean, from what I know, he met the authorities there, and they stationed him. They stationed him at. I just want to get this right.
Yeah, please.
They stationed him at Bat Galim.
Bat Galim, sure.
In Haifa.
Uh-huh.
And that was basically the first naval base of the state of Israel.
Correct.
But that since he had been in the Navy, he was stationed at Bat Galim.
And do you know where he goes from there, or what?
I'm just going to quote from his own words.
Sure, please.
If that's okay. The period immediately when he arrived was a very bloody time. He said there were many armed clashes, many assassinations and bombings going on of various buildings. I don't have to tell you, the King David Hotel, the Palestine Post, all those buildings. He said he had been serving guard duty at the Jewish Agency building about 2 hours before it was dynamited by the Arabs. He said in addition to guard duty, he helped run weapons to Jewish positions, but most of the time his year and a half service, he was stationed at Bat Galim, basically helping illegal immigrants disembark off of ships that were trying to come to Haifa through the British blockade.
Correct. Wow. And he never talked to you. Never talked to you about nothing.
No.
And you're reading this newspaper clipping from
He was interviewed by the Cleveland Jewish News on the 25th anniversary of the establishment of the State of Israel. And because he was a member of Machal, so one of the reporters at the newspaper thought that it might be a good story to interview somebody, and this is.
And that what is it? What's the title of the story?
It's called The Cleveland Jewish News. It's dated April 13th, 1973. Clevelander recalls his service in Machal, reliving the days of Israel's infancy.
Do you mind reading a little bit?
Just 2 paragraphs.
Okay.
Every Jew who is in Israel during the Israeli Independence Day next month will share a special feeling of pride as the Jewish state celebrates its 25th anniversary. But for Mrtin Estreicher of Beechwood, the occasion will have greater meaning than for the average tourist. For Mrtin Estreicher is a veteran of Machal, the volunteers from abroad who came to Israel in its struggle for nationhood 25 years ago.
And even when he did this interview in 1973,
Yes.
it was like there was no questions asked. You knew your sibling or nothing.
No.
And was that because of the nature of who he was?
Yes. Yeah. He wasn't a very verbal person.
And I see that you have some notes that you made here. Are these stuff that we talked about, or are this?
Some of it is, yeah.
And you told me that he meets your mother also in Israel at this.
So to make a long story short, he comes 6 days before the UN decides to partition. I will tell you that out of all of the dates in the beginning of the history of the State of Israel, the partition plan, the passing of the partition was actually the happiest time. All those movies, all those videos of you see people dancing the hora and celebrating, was the day that the United Nations voted to partition Palestine, because every person in Palestine at that point was listening to the radio, and when that vote was passed, they knew then that ultimately
it's going to happen.
It's going to happen.
Right.
And my father heard about it, and like I said, partook in it. Of course, as we all know, the State of Israel was declared May 5th, 1948, so that's
15th.
about May 15th.
Yeah.
That's 6 months after the partition plan, and everybody knew what was facing them at the time. So basically, to be honest, between the vote, the UN vote, and the establishment of the State of Israel, there were war preparations, because nobody was under any illusion.
Of course.
Nobody was under any illusion that there wasn't going to be a war. And after the celebration of the partition, it was a tense time.
It was a tense time, and that's basically when the War of Independence unofficially started.
Right. And
that's when the blockade on Jerusalem started.
Right. It was a tense time.
That's when the kibbutzes in the Negev were starting to get cut off. It was
So when he said in his article that he helped run weapons to Jewish positions, it probably was after the partition was announced, and before the war was. And at that time, he did what he could. Yeah. At that time.
And you were talking about your mother, that she came on a boat from.
My mother came on something called Aliyah Bet, which everybody knows. That the British initially encouraged Jewish immigration in the 20s. However, under immense Arab pressure, they slowly started to turned the screws, and all of a sudden, Jewish immigration stopped. Subsequent to that, after World War II ended, and there were all these Jewish people trying to emigrate to Israel and couldn't get in, so obviously they landed up in Cyprus, as we all know, but there were boats that tried to break the blockade,
sure.
And the Exodus, other boats, and whatever the case might be, Chai Belazarov. And there were people, and my father was stationed in Bat Galim. That's where they would come off. Yep. Some made it. Some were sent to Cyprus. It was a very turbulent time. And, if you were lucky, you got in. And if you weren't, you ended up in Cyprus. Eventually, all the people in Cyprus did come to Israel in 1949 after everything got settled. War was over. But it was a very tense time, and the vast majority of Aliyah Bet at that point in time were Holocaust survivors, having nowhere else to go. and trying to get in. And so my mother came in Aliyah Bet. I'm not sure the name of the ship, to be honest with you.
Do you know where it's sailed from?
It's, no, I don't remember where it sailed from.
Okay.
And she did not come to Israel, she came to Palestine in 40, at the end of 46 or the beginning of 47. But she was a teenager, and there were people, they let them in, the women and the young kids, and she ended up in a kibbutz run by Agudat Yisrael. There were various groups that took in these kids, and she ended up in a kibbutz.
You don't remember the name?
I can't recall the name right now. And run by Agudat Yisrael.
And how did they meet?
Well, the single guys and the single girls. I mean, you know, there were places where people met.
Socialized.
And my father, being a religious person, was looking for an Orthodox girl. And I can't tell you exactly how, but they ended up meeting. They got married in 1951.
So he stayed for a while.
Well, when he made Aliyah, it was not just the intention of fighting, it was the intention of staying. And
I see. Okay, I got you now. All right.
Yeah.
So he stayed.
So he stayed.
Okay.
And in 1951, my parents were married, and I was born in 1952 in Rishon LeZion. They lived in a one-room, you know, in Rishon LeZion. It was tough times. It was tzena.
What was your father doing there for work?
He actually got involved with the Histadrut, and he was helping to build what they call shikunim, which is these, you know, projects for immigrants.
Yeah.
And so he got involved since he was in the building business, if you remember I'm telling you, in Cleveland. So he said, you know, I'm in real estate. He says, I'm going to get involved. And he got involved in trying to help build shikunim, which were now being built for the hundreds of thousands of immigrants that were coming to Israel, not to forget all of the immigrants from the Arab countries. I mean, you're talking, you know, 900,000 immigrants, and the need for housing was like immense.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So in 49, 50, 51, 52, I mean, there was building going on, and, you know, trying to house, you know, north of 1 million immigrants into the nascent state of Israel. Which was broke, and he got involved in doing that. And that's what he did initially when he was there. He then got involved in building shikunim. I mean, he was involved in real estate or whatever the case might be. But he ran into some problems because the Histadrut gave him IOUs, and they never, and he went bankrupt.
Your father?
Yeah, because he couldn't pay the workers. The Histadrut gave him IOUs.
And then he decided that it's time to...
And then between that and my mother and the tzena and stuff like that, she convinced him to go back to Cleveland, where he came from, since those other brothers that he had were there. They had viable businesses, and she felt there was more of a future there. I mean, you're talking 52, 53, 54. It was tough times there. And so they eventually left Israel and moved back to Cleveland in the end of 1954.
And what does he do in Cleveland?
He gets involved in real estate. What else?
Okay.
Same thing.
Okay.
Purchasing homes, fixing them up.
Back to normal.
Flipping them.
No IOUs.
Selling.
No IOUs anymore.
No IOUs. Some of the homes he didn't sell, he rented.
Okay.
And so he got rental income. You know, and some he sold, some he rented. You know, what he knew.
Interesting. And was he active with the veterans of Machal in Cleveland, or was he? Or
No, his areas of interest were, he became a major macher in Jewish National Fund.
Okay.
That was his pet project. He believed in the reclamation of the land was the most important thing. And he became active in the Jewish National Fund. He took leadership roles. He was the treasurer. He was a secretary. Karen Kayemet. That was his baby. Not to mention being involved in the establishment of the day school in Cleveland called the Hebrew Academy of Cleveland, the establishment of Telz Yeshiva, which was the yeshiva that was established in Cleveland in the late 40s. He also started something called Cleveland Jewish Helpmates, which was an organization that employed developmentally disabled Jewish kids. Because at that time, if you were developmentally disabled, I mean, there was, not much there. So he and some other people got together an organization and employed developmentally disabled Jewish kids called the Cleveland Jewish Helpmates.
For like restaurant work?
Office work? It was the kind of repetitive work, stuff that like was repetitive, but for people that are developmentally disabled, it was
perfect.
A job,
yeah.
And
keeping them busy.
It kept them busy, and it made an income.
Yeah.
And so, I kind of remember growing up, he basically was out every night at a meeting. If it wasn't the school, it was the Karen Kayemet. If it wasn't Karen Kayemet, it was Cleveland Jewish Helpmates.
He was actually very active in the Jewish community.
Yes, yeah. And with those projects, and and him and his brothers were, they helped build the Jewish community in Cleveland. They're like, with other families, I'm not saying them, but with other families, they're like co-founders, of the Jewish community in Cleveland, whether it was the day school, whether it was the Young Israel of Cleveland, whether it was, all that sort of thing.
Was he ever regrettable about leaving Israel, or was he? Yeah,
I mean, I think that decision was made by the woman of the household, i.e. my mother, and those are the kinds of life decisions that we're all subject to. And
she had also come from the Holocaust.
She had come from the Holocaust, so it was a tough time, and I think that emotionally it was difficult for her to stay in Israel in the first couple of years.
I can only imagine.
And so it was complicated, and hey, that's a tough call.
When did your father pass away?
He passed away in 1989. Yeah, he was 74 years old. My mother is still alive. She lives in Miami Beach, which is only approximately a half hour away from here. I visit her about twice a week and sometimes spend Shabbat with her. And
where is she from?
She's from Romania.
Romania.
Yeah.
Okay.
A little town right outside of Sighet, close to Sighet. Called and thank God,
How old is your mother today?
She's 88 and a half.
88 and a half.
Yeah.
So there was about 10 years between them?
15 years.
15. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, at the time that they met, she was like a young Holocaust survivor, and he was already like an American businessman, and so it worked.
Wow. So she's from Romania.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay, so we have some documents and photos that I'm gonna take pictures of. Is there anything else that you feel that we haven't talked about regarding your father? And
I would only say this about my father, and I would want to leave you with these words. My father always felt that living in America, that the Jews had to unconditionally support the state of Israel. We can't have a voice in what goes on. We can't have a vote because we don't live there. And at the end of the day, whatever government it was, whether it was Labor, whether it was Likud, or whatever, he always supported the state. Because you cannot live in America and know what's better for the state of Israel 6,000 miles away. So he was an ardent Zionist, always supported the state through thick or thin, no matter what. He says that was our obligation as Jews. And he obviously lived his life that way, but not by words. He not only talked the talk, but he walked the walk. Okay. And that's what I wanted to leave everybody with. And it was like people like him in his generation, at the end of the day, that made the state of Israel possible by the sacrifices they made. Because nobody knew at the time they left in 1947 how it was going to all turn out. 2020 hindsight's great. Yeah. You know, oh yeah. But in 1947, when you boarded a ship to go to Palestine,
30 million against.
You don't know how it's going to end up, and those people made huge sacrifices.
Sure. And like I said, and like we said it before, a lot of them, you know, the American Machal people are different because they could have been persecuted. The other ones, South Africans, the English, the Canadians, it was fine. I mean, it was a great sacrifice. But the Americans had another thing on the table that they were sacrificing, and that was the embargo that President Truman put on.
That is correct. Yes.
And you know, there's stories of people who lost their citizenships, who went to jail, who couldn't come back.
Correct.
There was really
they left comfortable lives. They were employed. A lot of the Machal guys were young, but they were some married. Some of their wives were pregnant. Some had a kid. I mean, you're talking about huge sacrifices that these people made.
The odds on the board don't look good.
And they didn't look good. And we are the beneficiaries of those people's sacrifices.
Sure.
And we should never forget that.
Absolutely. Well, that's why I'm here. Absolutely.
Yeah. As far as documents go, so I don't know if you want to turn it on or off.
I'm going to turn it off right now for a second.